Good morning and hello. I wanted to just briefly comment on my interview yesterday with Reid Peterson. What a gentle spirit he is. And I wanted to just say there was just one concept that has really stuck with me. And it's the concept of how we get through hard times and that there's no solution. And I wish there was, I wish that when we're going through a hard time, someone would say, look, this is exactly what you have to do to get through this time. But that's not the case. And one of the only thing that exists when you get through a hard time is to get through that moment that's really difficult. And it might come as a surge, as a wave, as something you don't feel like you can tolerate it. And you find, if you can, not to isolate with it, but to find somebody who can really be there with you and just hold space and listen, not advise. And that's what he was talking about with the idea of the grief companion, to just be there in the wave with someone. And if you're on your own, it is to be there um, in the present moment, just using all of the things that you know about your own healing and your own calmness and your own centeredness, and go towards that, whether it's a memory of walking in the woods or the sound of the ocean, or just like I can keep breathing for the next 5 minutes and I can get through that moment or that feeling or that loss that's so intense for me. I can get through it. And just to know that the only way through a hard time is through the hard time. It's not going around it. It's going right straight through the middle, identifying and acknowledging your feelings, taking care of yourself, trying to find comfort, and also finding those people who you can reach out to. I hope you enjoy the interview. So one of the reasons why I love doing podcasts is I get to meet really interesting people and have deep conversations. So today I'm going to be having a conversation about grief and different ways to heal from grief. So happy to have you here, Reid, and talking to us about this subject. And I wondered if there's a way you might want to start out with us, just approaching this.
Well, I guess I'd like to start out by saying that a lot of times when people are grieving, it's really painful. And so they're looking for a recipe, I'm putting air quotes around this recipe because they don't want to feel the pain. It hurts too much. And although that's like a very human and legitimate reason for doing so, where I'd like to start is by saying that unfortunately, there's no cookie cutter recipe for grieving experience. It's pretty unique to the individual, and it really has some interdependence on the type of relationship that you had or have or how it changes. So it does get complex, and oftentimes it's very complicated. So that's where I'd like to start, Susan.
Mhm. Okay. Well, tell us about your work and how you um, meet up with people and how you start your process of helping them heal.
Okay. Traditionally, I'm trained in psychology, but I didn't ever pursue a clinical license. So I'm not the type of psychologist that would sit in the office and, do talk therapy, CBT, or many modalities that are common. I ended up pursuing like careers in corporate training and teaching and things like that. And then after losing my biological father back in 2006, and then 10 years later, my stepfather, uh, I had a really unique grief experience for myself where I kind of threw this expectation on me by saying like, well, after losing Warren, my stepdad, I was like, well, I've been through loss specifically of a father figure. I've been here before. I know how to do this, and I'll be fine. But I was pretty upended. Grief hit me pretty darn hard, and so it was a long process. And to this day, there's times I'll think about him and feel emotion. Grief is never done. Maybe that's another topic to touch in on.
Hmm.
However, the process, being trained in psychology, the process really kind of alerted me to some of like how different a human experience is when loss is endured. And it led down this path to more training and learning and experiencing and finding a community of people who were able to make space for talking about, um, the harder things about death, dying, grieving, mourning, all of it. And so I said, okay, this is something special. And in my humble opinion, it's much needed in the world. And so I decided to put together technology resources and developed a mobile app and, looking for ways to help because I just knew it was a long and isolating and sometimes very sad and dark journey. And so I was like, well, if I can provide some relief and some comfort, I can do that through technology. And then that evolved to meeting with individuals. And I do what's called, I call it grief care. Some may kind of throw it in a box of like coaching or companioning or mildly loosely counseling. But it does have some of those aspects, but I just think it's really about giving full full witnessed attention without a specific agenda
Hmm.
um, for someone who's grieving. And that's where I see people feel healing is when they feel seen and heard and not judged. So
Yeah.
that's a lot said there.
Yeah, when we were talking initially before we got on the call, we were talking a little bit about this idea about how people respond if somebody has a loss, and they talk about their loss or the losses they've had, and what you're trying to do in your approach is just really be 100% present for that person, however they need to be. I can imagine like looking at the background that you have, like just walking in that field with you, talking about something that's really difficult for however long that I would need to maybe sit against that tree and not have like an agenda about it. And I think sometimes like there is those two ends of the spectrum, right? Of, I know in the transformational groups that I run, people who have lost a relationship, a long-term relationship, and don't know how to really live without that person. They might still be on the planet. That that it's really difficult to talk about loss. Like it's hard to like break down in front of anybody and feel like anyone's really going to understand or care. And so sometimes I think people tend to just isolate and not talk about it and avoid it. Maybe just get into, for lack of a better way to say it, like bad habits and numbing and maybe working too much or doing things that make them not feel.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's really well said. It reminds me of what I've heard from a lot of people grieving who have said that. I can tell that, if they name a friend or they name a family member, I can tell that their intentions are good, yet, however, what they say or what they do ends up hurting. And that, it's it's ironic, I guess, for lack of a better word, because you want to give people the benefit of the doubt. They are well intended, and yet there's still a lot of pain with like kind of the outcome. And so that does happen a lot, and that is a big reason for why people isolate and grieve in isolation.
mhm. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit about sometimes I think in my groups and in myself when I have these huge grief factors that I bump into, that there's a healthy way. I think it's healthy, like compartmentalization, but then I wonder whether that actually is that avoidance. Like when does compartmentalizing the painful thought of missing somebody who's not around anymore, as it enters your day, not allowing it to enter parts of your day where you really have to focus and function. And then when is it just plain avoiding? Um, and then getting used to just avoiding it.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that wonder because I think yeah, I wish there were more clear descriptions between those aspects. I don't know. I think that's probably just as unique as people's grief process because there are times of healthy avoidance, and there are times where avoidance is probably going to cause more issues or more trouble further
Mhm.
down the line because it's not, it's not something that you can just keep avoiding. It's you gotta something to face, embrace, and work through.
So if you have found somebody that comes to you and maybe has, I love the idea of your retreats that people could hang out with you for a few days and just get into almost like the spaciousness of being able to be around someone who's open to being with them and their grief thoughts. Like maybe they can't be with their grief thoughts on their own, and so you're kind of with them, just allowing them to have them, however, or helping them talk about things that they don't usually talk about. Where do you give me an example of or a story of sometimes that had been like, something that was someone that was really, really was hiding their grief and it took them a while to access it. Like tell me some of the tools you used or some of the ways you knew that. Like 'cause it sounds like you're a pretty intuitive person.
Mm. Well, yeah, thanks for saying that. I try to be. Can we try to be intuitive? I don't know. But well, part of the magic, and again, another air quotes around the word magic, uh, part of like what helps with these personalized retreats is that when people say yes, they're almost like committing to saying yes to their own grief process. They've It's special because they've hit a point where they're like, I no longer can try to ignore, avoid, pretend, and deny, that this has happened to me. It's just not working. So they struggle. And then when they say yes and they come out to where the area I live in San Luis Obispo, and they actually stay on our property and it's a different separate unit. So they have their privacy, but we spend a long time together and sometimes we sit, sometimes we drink tea, sometimes we go for walks, sometimes we go out to the ocean and just be. And so there's a lot of emotion and a lot of crying, which is we all expect when mourning a loss. However, there's a lot of slowing down, and in that slowing down is I think where they find some perspective that they weren't able to find in their busy lives, wherever they were coming from. And then in that perspective too, they kind of you've been using the word transformation, and I really subscribe to that word too. I think that's when they start to feel some internal shifts and they start to experience a little bit of transformation in their own lives, where it's like, okay, I now see this differently, or okay, I I've worked through some feelings, and I'm not as stuck in that feeling. So that's the general sense. Would you like me to share a specific instance?
Yeah, yeah, because I'm curious about like, and also maybe this will be in the story. Like when people are coming to you, are they like anticipatory, like, oh, good, I found him, I know I'm going to go there, or is it like they've been struggling in stuckness for such a long time they have to do something, So I'm curious about those questions.
Yeah, it's more of the latter. More of the people who come out have been struggling with grief for a while. A while is more broad, but it could be
Mhm.
anywhere from a year to 5 years. And they just, they've tried things. They've worked with counselors, they've done groups, and they read books and, some of the more traditional things that we do, which obviously have purpose and have value. I'm not demising them, but sometimes, that uniqueness of grief where I started off with, it can really halter some people. So I'm thinking of actually because relationships are kind of well, they're your niche. I'll share a story of a person I'm going to call Janet, which is a made-up name to protect her privacy. But Janet was blindsided with actually a loss. Her husband told her we weren't compatible, and I want a divorce, and is blindsided because there was kind of no fair warning. They would have their conflicts, but it was kind of normal. It wasn't, nobody in relationship doesn't have conflict.
Right.
And so um, after being together 10 years, she just was in utter shock. And so they went through the process of divorce, and unfortunately, during that time, Janet lost her father too, and it was unexpected. He was healthy. He was older, but he was healthy. Believe it or not, he
Mm.
died in a plane crash, and so these are a little bit of the parameters. And she tried to continue to live life, and to her credit, she actually gave space for her grief. She is a stand-up paddleboarder. And in her area, she would stand up paddleboard, and that's where she would feel a lot of her emotion because she was out on the water and it was more calm than not. Um, and she would mourn, but after I think it was 2.5 years, she felt like she needed to be back in quote society. People were telling her she should date again. People were telling her, um, why haven't you moved on? It's been 2.5 years that you had these losses. And she started to feel some insecurity. And she also felt like she was definitely being judged. And so what does that do? And I think this is pretty common for everyone listening. When you hear messages like that, you start to think that something's wrong with you. And so, she looked for something to do differently to try to fix this. And I believe she ended up finding me because she valued nature.
Mhm.
Nature is, a medicine that we use. I mentioned the hikes and going to the ocean. I'm lucky and grateful and sometimes privileged to live in an area where there's a lot of different elements of nature to just be in. And so when she came out, that's what she told me. She said, I just feel like something's wrong with me and I need to fix it. And so I didn't really focus on that, Susan. I more just listened, and I was like, well, I tried to help her understand what she was going through is quite human. And as a human, we will think that things are wrong with us when indeed it may just be part of part of growth, part of transformation, and part of enduring loss, because a lot of life is enduring loss. And so I think it helped soften some of her self-judgment and the voices, the external voices that were influencing her thinking something's wrong with her. Those began to soften too, or at least her buy-in on that. And so with Janet, we did go to the ocean because the water, I mentioned the stand-up paddleboarding. And I love the ocean because with the water, the waves are always moving. And there's, I don't know, there's probably science and there's probably metaphysics involved with it, but there's just great things that happen around the ocean. And so um, there's a lot of walking, there's a lot of sitting, there's a lot of taking in like the changes of the water and the sun and all of these, were strongly associated with just some of our conversations, just some of like subtle, gentle, easygoing conversations where there was what she trusted a lot of space to just to feel things through. And so she would mourn and things like that. And on these personalized retreats, we actually, connect later in the day, Thursday, and then depending on travel plans, say our goodbyes Sunday. So it's only a few days, but I'll knock on wood and say that everybody that I've supported, like, has when they've gone back home, they've been fully appreciative. They've said that they felt different and they've like had some trust and belief that, they could move forward in their life if they were previously feeling stuck.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it almost is like it feels like a marker, especially with Janet. She had two unexpected endings, losses to relationships that were really important to her, right? And both of them got blindsiding. So then you might put your best foot forward to go forward, but then you're still struggling with like what else is going to happen. And so
Hmm.
having a time where you're just talking without rush, processing your feelings without okay, 50-minute hour, I've got to pack that away till next week, but just giving yourself time to, it sounds like, I wonder about this entering into the stage of acceptance sometimes, like it's hard to to ride that wave of, or that edge of acceptance. Like, what do I have to do to accept that this has happened? Or this is what's my life is looking like now, right?
Hmm.
This person isn't there anymore. And what is my next, chapter going to be like then? It seems like just the mind also, just like water, moving, will start working it out. I mean, I think we all organically want to heal, but sometimes we don't give ourselves the right environments to heal in, or just enough space in our heads, or just enough soundboard, a person that is a good sounding board for that. Especially if you feel like sometimes people who aren't neutral family friends, you get more judgment than acceptance, right? Or
Yep.
want to tell you or lead you or direct you or tell you that this is how you should be feeling or this is what you should be doing. Um, but you have to come, and probably, as you probably know this, I know this really well in the groups that I run, is like everyone that those kinds of that kind of feedback just is a static. It creates static instead of like the person really has to find that answer themselves. They just have to give themselves time to find that answer. Um, Whatever way it could be, like a magical thing like paddleboarding, but paddleboarding with like a guide with them
Hmm.
who's
Yeah.
processing the feelings with them, or saying, I heard you say that, or that was a really important thing you just said. Did you hear yourself say that? Um, is more important, than, because the mind will also stop listening to itself, because we might
Hmm.
ruminate about the same thing over and over again, or cycle in the same thought of guilt thought, like if only I did this or said that, or whatever it might be, regret thoughts or bargaining thoughts.
Hmm. Yeah. I like your mention of the guide, and I tend to more think of myself as a companion than a guide, but there are times where guidance is needed. And I like that you said that because ah, I wish it weren't true, but there's a lean towards grieving in isolation because I think the bottom line is it feels safer. And it feels safer because there's less outside noise that, you know, furthers the pain or deepens the pain. And so when people grieve in isolation, I also believe that a lot of times they'll have repetitive loops going on in their mind. and that's, that's a contribution, a big contribution for why people say that they feel stuck. A lot of people say they feel stuck in grief. And so with the support of someone else in a
Mhm.
form of a guide, it can be gentle and it can be subtle, but it can make such a big difference because the loops, the patterns, they can be questioned or called out or
Mhm.
nurtured so that they, take a different shape and a different form. Um,
Mhm.
I've found that to be like a very key element in a lot of the healing and transformation process.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think there's that piece of like if you're not getting through the grief, you might have indications of not moving on or just real unhappiness or even hiding yourself more and more, right? Because people don't want to hear it anymore that you're struggling. And then it is hard to socialize if you're struggling. Um, Maybe you're at that raw part of grief from time to time where you're just like can't stop crying. It's really hard to go out in public if that's the case. So then
Sure
it
is.
feels like then what are your options? Like, just spending time by yourself, which is that loop again. You're not getting out of that feeling.
Hmm.
Tell me what influenced you to do this work the way you do it and to keep going with this the service of helping people by being a grief companion.
Yeah, after my stepdad Warren died, it was kind of a wake-up call. I wish I had like great ways to articulate it, but it was like this wake-up call where it's like, Reid, like you developed a lot of skills that are more counseling related skills than anything that I just wasn't utilizing. And it just felt like it was time to kind of open myself up and be more available to that. And I also saw that, well, this was pandemic times. I also saw a lot of people, really getting just flooded with loss. Um, it was all over our media, of course. We know the stories, we've experienced it. But I was just like, wow, that got me more opening up to some writing and publishing articles on the internet. And I guess I started doing some podcasting at that time and really wanted to just create like a tool at the time for people to feel a little bit more validated. And then the retreats, I from the get-go, I actually wanted to open a retreat center. So I was like really pursuing like what is it called? Non establishing nonprofit status and looking at business entities and everything. And then but I was just like, well, I'm not going to do any of that when we just start a pandemic. Um, and so I was like, well, I'll circle back to that. And when I circled back, it took a different shape and form. I never, looked to invest into um, hundreds of acres for a retreat center, although it would be wonderful. I could see a lot of people benefiting from it.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I was like, well, we have a property where we live that we feel it's very accommodating and hospitable for people who need some healing in their lives. And um, so I got support from my wife on it, and we did some updates to our property and made that available, and it's been a fun endeavor.
Mhm.
Something
So that's a really unique way of doing it is, and then the app that you created was tell us about the app.
The app was definitely focused on, helping a grieving person feel a bit more soothed.
Mhm.
Um, I kept hearing, I'll call them keywords. I kept hearing keywords and communicating with people that, in addition to like sadness or depression and isolation, I was hearing people say like, I can't relax. I can't compartmentalize. And so that was kind of my angle for trying to make something that was a little bit more unique. It was like, well, what can I do to provide that? And I'm sure your listeners who have heard my voice say, well, he's got, kind of a more monotone, hypnotic voice. And so with the app, there's a lot of audio on there. And
Oh, nice.
it's a lot of
Mhm.
voice narration. It's not a meditation, but it's like a meditation, and it's got soothing sounds and I kind of talk through a reflection. It's random. It's not logical or linear as far as, something stages of grief related. But each day something is shared, a bit of a reflection of the grieving process and
So give
the
me a reflection off the top of your head that that's in your app.
um
And let's see if the
well
audience, like today, if you're just happen to be listening to it, if this reflection fits for you in any way, shape, or form.
today's one, the title was called Stirred. And with Stirred, it's really a reflection on experiencing a full range, or not a full range, but a diverse range of emotions. And so Stirred is about like recognizing that you can feel happy, you can feel sad. It shifts moment to moment. Like it's, mm, as in a metaphor, it's all a whirlwind going on inside. So for people who would listen to Stirred, would my hope would be that they take away is like, okay, it's a shitstorm inside, and yet I'm functioning. And as long as I'm functioning, I may need to take one small step forward in my day or my journey. However, I'm still moving. I'm not stuck.
I love that. I think that that's also the idea of stirred is that you can have more than one feeling going on at any time. So even if you're compartmentalizing at work, you're like, if you just go inside internally for a minute and think, oh yeah, there's a shitstorm happening in there, but there's also this but the part of grief and memories coming up and sadness coming in, but there's also like I can step out of that and answer these calls. Like it's interesting how us humans are, we can handle a lot of different emotions at the same time, but it takes that centering to like, okay, what are all of these emotions that I'm experiencing, and what's the thinking, the thought that's behind the feeling and the story or the memory that's coming through, or the drive of what I want to do with it. So, so it's interesting. I think it's a perfect word. It's a perfect word for today too. I think so. Um, and I think sometimes when there's a lot going on outside of us in the world, then we are stirred inside because we're being provoked by all the I don't know, fear, energy that's around us, right? And so if you're grieving, it's almost like the opposite, like when we're in our environment stirs us, but internally if we're stirred because we have all these grief feelings that we don't wear them on our sleeves all the time, but they might always be there. And we're managing them like, no, you can't feel like that right now. You've got a board meeting to go to, or you're driving, or you got to really, attend to the household chores right now, but you do need to let that feeling out at some point in the appropriate place. So when you have all these stirred, if you had the stirred feelings at the retreat, it's perfect because you could explore each of them on a palette in a way, and
Mhm.
and give them each space and a voice and a memory and all of that with somebody, sharing it with someone, which makes it so powerful to say out loud too and share it with someone who's not going to have judgment, who's just going to give you space to talk and feel and express, right?
Yeah. You know what, Susan, I want to say thank you because I feel like the way you responded to what I shared about Stirred was like one of the most human ways I've ever heard of somebody speak to about resiliency without calling it resiliency because it's got,
Yeah.
well, I don't know if it's tabooed, but there's sometimes now there's toxic positivity associated with resiliency. Yet, however, as humans, like so many things are happening and a lot of them aren't pleasant. And yet, we still, strive for joy and positive experience in our lives. And your articulation of it was beautiful. So
Oh,
thank you.
thank you. Well, I also was thinking when you of this other part is that it's almost like another form of self-acceptance when you allow yourself to have a stirred feeling. Because, as you know, let's say in my group, a lot of times people struggle with like making new friends after they've had a traumatic experience. Like they're not the same person anymore, and sometimes their friendships aren't working as much as they used to. So they're changed, and they want to be around people who are maybe have had a life-changing event, right? That's going to be another area where that would help them evolve and grow and move forward if they were with more like-minded people. But then in terms of coming into friendship again, it's like also, wait a second, I have this whole other aspect of myself now that sometimes I need to make room for. So it's almost like a true friend. And if you're a true friend to yourself, right, you're accepting all the different areas, parts of yourself. And if a true friend would do that too, they'd accept that sometimes you're really fragile and weak and emotional, and they'd also accept that you're super functional and fun at other times. But that's like, I think that's another I don't know why I'm thinking about that now, but that's another thought that I think is a challenging thing for us humans to understand, that we can find that. We can find that in our weakness, we can have our weakness, and that's not the only part that people are going to see, right? Our
Mhm.
weakness meaning like if we are breaking down, the supposed weakness, although we know that the strength, the weakness is the strength, right? The vulnerability is the gift.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah. I'm humbled with your wisdom.
Well, the other thought I had for you too is that in the groups that I run, a lot of times people get really plowed over with other grief factors that happen in their life. Like if, just like Janet, like if a dog dies, or if if they really needed that friend who was their really good friend that they lost in like the transformation of their relationship, if they separated from their long-term partner, they really needed that old life, that group of friends that they used to have to get through something. And that's like loss comes in all different ways, right? And how to find those places where you can anchor and try to figure out how you're going to get through it, because there's no way through it, around it, it's just through, right?
Yeah.
That sobriety saying.
Yeah, I'm reminded of somebody I've worked with. She didn't come out for a retreat, but we would chat about once a month on Zoom. And this lady, she, in a span of 3 years, she lost her husband um, of physical death, and also COVID. And then, ironically, two of her three sons died, somehow related to substance abuse. And so, three physical deaths within 3 years. And at the same time, she had kind of some kind of compromised system in her lung functionality. So she was just beyond afraid of catching COVID and dying.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm.
and so being overwhelmed with loss and grief was an understatement. And I'm reminded of like one specific meeting or call that we had, and we were chatting, and she asked me just flat out, she said, with so much loss, how does somebody deal with that? And I said, I don't know if there's an exact answer to your question, but what I do know is, as exhausting as it is, you face the moment, and you have to just say like, okay, I'm going to live for this moment now, and rinse and repeat for whatever moment comes next. And she didn't take it lightly. She was upset and she wanted a solution. And what I was saying didn't sound like a solution to her.
Right.
What I will say is, at the time of our recording in this lovely conversation, it's 2 years post that time, and she's much more comfortable, and it's wonderful to see her smile and to understand that she's been resilient and she's found a way to navigate her losses and her grief and continue to live too. And
Mhm.
that's ultimately what it's all about.
Right. Finding a way to live through the things that you feel like you couldn't bear.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's just even saying that, like the things that people have to deal with it, they just can't think they can't bear. I mean, sometimes when us practitioners can't imagine how they're going to bear the things that they might have to bear, get through, figure out a way to be in this present moment, right? But that is what you're saying is there. That's what you can offer them, to be in a moment, to get through that moment. Maybe there's like 10 others coming down the pike pretty quickly, but how to get through that particular moment, holding them in that moment and getting through that moment and acknowledging you got through that moment. So there's going to be another storm, that another stir that might happen, and you're going to have to get through that one too. So these are some of the ways, is like, get yourself, I love that idea about helping people get comfortable with that, not like complacent, but comfortable. It's almost like an active comfortable.
Mhm.
Okay, I can use nature, I can use the person that is giving me the model of how to be with someone when I'm in this kind of pain, right?
Mhm.
Because you're
Yeah.
modeling for them how to be there.
Yeah, just enough guidance, like you
Yeah,
said earlier.
yeah. And it's so inspiring that you did it through COVID and the times that this is when it all sort of started, the birth of this process that you do with people. And and I also wonder, if you think about it as a holistic thing, what do you feel like people are really calling you for? I mean, not on the phone necessarily, but what are people calling for? What are they needing now that you've been really, paying attention to or noticing, that might have shifted since the time you started doing this work with people?
Oh, wow, that's a beautiful question. My head wants to like quickly jump to something and say, oh, it's this. And then I'm like, gosh, this question, I feel like I need to answer, with a source from my heart. Um, Definitely compassion, definitely empathy.
Mhm.
Maybe those are now in our culture toxic positivity terms too. Um, but just genuine care. I think that's
Yeah.
with the heart, it's you know our culture, there's so many beautiful things about our culture, and yet, on a feeling level, I do find myself being a little bit more critical of our culture. And I'm like, even with people who are love and support networks for another, sometimes there's strings attached and agendas, and it's like they need that genuine care
Mhm.
and they're missing out on it. So I think that's why they reach out to me.
Yeah, there's this Tachnet Yan, am I saying that name right? He had done this interview where I heard this aspect of him talking about compassionate listening, where there's like two levels of listening, right? In the first one, and this is probably what you do, I'm just thinking this is what you do, is you just listen fully, 100% present, and you don't offer any suggestion or this is another way to think about it or anything. But when someone feels really heard, and then they might come back to that same, um, topic in a different way, then once you've really heard them, you can sort of say something else to them and they might be able to hear that, but nobody can really hear support or comfort if you don't really completely 100% allow them to take up that whole space. So it's not like I'm thinking about the next thing I'm about to say to her or them, but just allowing them, like, is that all like, until there's no more words coming out, right?
Hmm.
We're so fast to try to solve it for people. I love that you couldn't solve it. You could only say, I can only help you through this moment by just being with you here and hoping you can be with this moment too.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah, I'm not a TikToker, but my sister informed me of this, and she's in a whole different industry. She's in the restaurant business. But she said, have you ever seen that TikTok video where I don't know the context, but essentially the person says to the other, do you want comfort or do you want solutions? And and my wife's a psychologist, and I shared that with her at dinner once, and she's like, I love that. I'm going to use that. So we
right.
playfully we actually say that to each other, but it has.
I think it's a great thing to say because it's like, what do you just want space to talk about it and be with this, me to be with you here in this moment? Or do you want me to, tell you some strategies I'm thinking? Like, do you want me to be more directive or do you want me to just be here for you in any way? Right. I like that. I think that's also a really good directive to people who are listening of how to be with people who are grieving,
Hmm.
to ask them. One of my clients said this thing too, is that when people are grieving, that you let them talk and then you come back around and bring it up again to see if they want to talk more. Because a lot of times people might think like, okay, well, I got something in there about my grief, but I don't really know if the person really wants to hear any more of it. So it's almost like bringing it back around, like, let's try, because sometimes they're saturated after saying it, right? Too much emotion kind of comes out like a funnel, and then but they may need another opportunity to see that you can handle it or you're welcoming more. So it's been so
Yeah.
nice to talk to you about, especially with the scenery behind you and just hearing the pace that you speak and work with people. It's been really nice to just get into that frame of what it would be like to be working with you. Um, and again, I just feel like there's such the gift of so many people out there doing amazing work in different ways. Um, that if you're needing help and you're not getting through something, like, this is one of the ways that might help
Hmm.
to just
That's
stay in it alone.
that's possible.
Yeah.
And trust your gut, you know.
Yes. Is there anything in closing that you want to tell us about?
I Nothing comes to mind. I just am very appreciative and grateful for, a lovely conversation with you. And I want to thank you for your wisdom. I feel like I'm learning a lot now I'm talking to you.
Well, I'm really glad that I got that uh message on listserv. It would just like tweaked my attention. So I'm really glad that we were able to meet each other and have this conversation too, because I've learned a lot just by how you hold space with me, of how you hold space with other people. So it feels really comforting, really, really easy to be with you. So thanks for that experience.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you.